Our reporter Victoria Smith joins me now in the studio for more on this. Morning to you, Victoria.
Morning, Rosie.
So Boris Johnson asked the fourth time he gets that general election. But how are the numbers stacking up at this point? Is Boris Johnson going to get the outcome he wants?
Well, the pollsters and the bookies are very busy now crunching those numbers. We know that the Conservatives start this next 6-week campaign with a 10-point lead in the polls. But as we know, numbers can be misleading. If we think back to the 2017 general election when Prime Minister Theresa May had a big majority. She went to the country and came back with a much reduced majority. And at the same time, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party ran a stronger campaign than expected. Now, this time round, it will be a Brexit campaign for Boris Johnson. His strategy will be to pitch himself as a kind of Brexit martyr, raked over the coals by Parliament and the courts in defiance of the will of the people. That'll be his strategy, which could play well. Alternatively, he could be punished for failing to get Brexit over the October 31st deadline. For Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, a focus on other issues aside from Brexit: social welfare, health, free education for students, that kind of thing. So, looking at how the numbers crunch this time round, we've been talking to Ben Page, who's the chief executive of pollsters Ipsos Mori.
Anybody would be a fool to try and predict the result of this general election 6 weeks before it takes place. So I'm not going to do that. All I would say is that today, at the end of October, we've got the Conservatives well ahead. If nothing changed, it would appear that they should be able to scrape some sort of majority together. If you don't want to look at the headline results in the polls, another predictive factor that has been very reliable for the last 30 or 40 years is not who's people's position in the polls at the start of the campaign, but rather who is seen as the best Prime Minister and the best person to run the economy.
What about Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party? How are they expected to do?
Well, they have been quiet up till now, but you could expect some noise from now on. They'll be offering a clean break with the EU, effectively a no-deal arrangement. And both the leaders, Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, will be looking over their shoulders a little bit just to see where their votes might go, particularly in those constituencies that have voted Leave in the past and are expected to again. So the Brexit Party could start making a little bit of noise throughout the next 6 weeks.
We haven't had an election in the UK for nearly 100 years in December. It's quite unusual, this one.
It is quite unusual being in December. We haven't had one since 1923. Some fear that the weather, the darkness, the Christmas could be a factor. But again, we asked Ben Page of Ipsos Mori about this, and he doesn't think the fact it's December will count for too much.
I do think there's a lot of folklore about weather that is probably less important than it sounds. Remember, millions and millions of people will now cast their votes by post, so the weather probably isn't going to affect them that much. We all have central heating and things like that now, which we didn't in the 1920s. And the evidence is that the weather probably affects it much less than one might imagine.
Well, what we do know is if the Lords approve this by the end of the week, we can expect a pre-Christmas election with bells on.
Thank you, Victoria Smith, our journalist.